Part 2. This is a continuation of the story. The link to the first part is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching. Less than a week later, Claude got the information he needed. He learned that I was now a professor at the college, and Rena was working there as a nurse as well. Claude contemplated his next move. Perhaps it was time for a confrontation, and if Rena was as attractive as he'd heard, maybe he could have some fun too. A smile crept onto his face as he began to formulate a plan. Later that week, I returned home from the university to find Rena in the kitchen, looking troubled. "What's wrong?" I asked. She shared that she had called home and that Nephi was upset about being apart from her. Rena had been like a mother to Nephi, and now they lived halfway around the world from each other. Nephi wanted to see her, and that made Rena sad. As I listened, I began to wonder if we could bring Nephi to live with us. She was now 19 and had graduated from high school. I could look into the possibility of her enrolling at Taft next term. I knew people in the admissions department, so I could find out what we needed to do to get Nephi enrolled. I thought back to our conversation in Indonesia. I had promised Nephi that there would always be a place for her with us, and I didn't want to let her down. Rena and I discussed it. She was happy about the possibility but also a little concerned. "Nephi is so innocent. Do you think she will be okay here?" she asked, a look of worry on her face. Rena made a good point. Nephi was trusting, and I knew there were untrustworthy people everywhere, including in the US. But I reassured her, saying, "As long as we're around, we can make sure she's safe. We'll take good care of her." I promised to look into it the next day. I talked to some people at Taft, and it seemed like there would be a few hoops to jump through, but it was likely we could get Nephi enrolled by the next term. Rena shared that Nephi was ecstatic about coming to America, attending college, and most of all, living with her again. Over the next few weeks, we began planning for Nephi's arrival. There was a lot to do, especially since we were both still working full-time. When possible, Rena and I commuted to school together. Since she didn't have a U.S. driver's license yet, she would ride her bicycle to the clinic when our schedules didn't match. I had warned her to always use a sturdy bike lock, as bike theft was common. It was a nice day that Wednesday, and I had a late class, so Rena rode her bike home. When I got home a little after 6, I could tell something was wrong. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her arms wrapped around herself and shivering. "Rena, honey," I rushed to her. "What's wrong?" I held her gently, feeling her slight trembling. Stepping back, I looked for any visible injuries but found her physically fine, just very shaken up. "There was this man," she began. "He drove a big car and pulled over in front of me when I was riding home." She continued, telling me how she had been almost home when a large black vehicle swerved in front of her. She had to brake quickly to avoid running into it. "A man got out, and at first, he seemed nice, but then he started acting too friendly. He asked me my name, where I was going, and where I lived. I didn't really answer. I tried to be polite and get around him, but he kept blocking my way. At one point, he even grabbed the handlebars of my bike to stop me." Rena managed to maneuver away from him and quickly rode up onto the sidewalk to escape. But what really bothered her was that as she rode away, he called out, "See you later, Rena." It took her a moment to realize she had never given him her name. Meanwhile, Claude and Jasmine were sitting in the back of Papaya, where Claude had just recounted his encounter with Rena. "Yeah, it scared her," he laughed. "Is that it?" Jasmine asked. "You just scared her? That's all you're going to do?" Claude felt irritation rising. He had his people track down information on my new wife, and he wasn't pleased with Jasmine's response. "What else would you like me to do?" he asked, forcing patience. "Well, you could start by confronting him again," Jasmine suggested. "This time, I'd like to see it, and maybe have his new wife see it too." Claude considered this for a moment. If that's what Jasmine wanted, he'd gladly take action again. "Okay," he nodded, his expression shifting to a smirk. "I know where they usually go on Saturday mornings." That Saturday, the weather was nice, and Rena and I headed to the park to play tennis. She had a lot more skill than I did, having grown up playing. I tried to compensate with my physical advantage, but she usually won. The park had 3 fenced courts, and if we got there early enough, at least one was typically open. This particular Saturday, all 3 courts were available when we arrived. As we played, I noticed that 2 of the other courts were now occupied, but one remained vacant. Then I saw something behind me that distracted Rena. She missed a shot she would normally make. Her gaze was focused on something over my shoulder. Turning around, I saw 2 familiar figures approaching with tennis rackets, Jasmine and her brother, Claude. "There's another court open," I called out, pointing to the far court. "We're just going to watch for a minute," Claude replied with a feigned smile. "Maybe pick up some pointers," he added as they settled onto the wooden bench beside our court. Rena and I continued to play, but the tension from our unexpected spectators took the fun out of it. Rena walked to the net, her voice barely a whisper. "That's the man who stopped me on my bike. I want to go now." I hesitated. I didn't want them to think they could intimidate us. "Let's play a few more minutes," I encouraged her, and she nodded reluctantly. Claude then stood up and walked toward Rena. "How about doubles?" he suggested. "Me and Rena against the 2 ex-spouses. Come on, it'll be fun." I knew Claude was a bully, and I had to stand my ground. "All right, for just a minute," I replied. Rena served the ball, and I hit it back toward Claude. He returned it hard, sending the ball sailing over the fence. I took a deep breath and went to retrieve it. As I approached, I saw Claude standing close to Rena, his arm around her. My heart raced as I rushed back through the gate. "Hey!" I shouted. "Get your hands off her!" Claude turned to face me and, sensing my approach, threw a wild punch. Thanks to my training, I managed to dodge most of it, but still went down from the impact. As I sat there, stunned, Claude loomed over me with that same vicious smile he had worn years ago when he'd beaten me in an alley. I remembered the promise I made to myself: no one would ever do that to me again, especially not in front of my wife. Quickly scrambling to my feet, I saw surprise flicker in Claude's eyes as I stood. "Ready to get your butt kicked again?" he shouted as I squared off against him. Since our last confrontation, some things had changed. I was now about 30 pounds heavier, mostly muscle, while Claude had added weight primarily around his midsection. Thanks to my training, I had learned how to fight. I held my hands up in the stance I'd been taught. "Want to try again, huh?" I taunted. Claude paused, sizing me up, then moved in. He relied on brute strength. I had been trained. As he threw a straight punch, I redirected it with a slap to his forearm. Drawing on my training in close combat, I delivered a hammer fist to his chest and a quick strike to his jaw. His surprise was evident, and I couldn't help but smirk. "Did I catch you off guard?" I challenged him, knowing he remembered me as the defenseless guy from our previous encounter. This time, there was an audience. I bounced on my feet, hands up defensively. Claude approached in a brawler's stance, and when he got within reach, I bent forward and executed a fierce side kick. The impact was solid, and I could tell it hurt him. "Owen, stop!" Rena pleaded, her voice breaking my focus. In that moment of distraction, Claude charged at me. As he reached for me, I grabbed his wrist, twisting it back and gaining control. I forced him down, dropping my elbow into his solar plexus and following up with 2 quick strikes to his head. He fell to his knees, clearly done. "Okay, Claude, we're even," I said, stepping back. "Let's forget this." "Screw you," he snarled, still breathing heavily. "We're just getting started," he spat back, trying to muster the strength for another attack. I was ready. I dodged his reach, maintaining control over his wrist, and forced him down again. I struck him one last time, ensuring he wouldn't get up for a while. Before I left, I kicked him lightly, just to emphasize my point. I shot a smirk at Jasmine as we walked away, leaving her speechless. She had a new view of me now. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I felt relief knowing Claude wouldn't bother us again, or so I thought. Life went on, and for the next few weeks, there was no sign of him or Jasmine. Rena was more cautious now, often opting not to ride her bike to school, but otherwise, things had returned to normal. We were busy fixing up the guest bedroom in our cottage. With 3 bedrooms in total, Rena and I occupied the upstairs, while the main floor had an office and a guest room. We hadn't had guests yet, but that was about to change. In just over a month, Nephi would be arriving. Rena often spoke to Nephi, and the younger girl was thrilled about coming to America to reunite with her sister. I sensed a hint of sadness from Baki, who jokingly lamented about being left alone on the farm while everyone moved to America. On the drive to the airport to pick up Nephi, both of us were buzzing with excitement. This was a new life for Nephi, and we were glad to help her on this adventure. When we finally spotted her at the airport, her expression was a mix of excitement, fear, happiness, and confusion, a beautiful tapestry of emotions on the face of this innocent young woman. When she saw Rena, she dashed across the terminal, tears streaming down her cheeks, and embraced her sister tightly. The drive home was quiet. Nephi gazed out the window, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings that were so different from her home in Indonesia. When Rena showed her to her room, with its bright yellow walls and flowers in a vase, Nephi's tears flowed again. "Is this really mine?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rena smiled and nodded, filled with warmth. Over the next week, we drove Nephi around, showing her the sights, exploring the college, and trying out various restaurants. Summer session at Taft was starting the following Monday, and we enrolled her in some foundational courses to prepare her for business classes in the fall. Nephi began to acclimate to life in America, adjusting well, but we had to help her shake one bad habit: American daytime TV. The soap operas, game shows, and reality shows felt like junk food for the brain. One night, I broached a concern with Rena. "You need to talk to her," I said. "Warn her about the average American male." I couldn't shake the unsettling memories of my own college experiences and the stories I'd heard. Nephi was innocent and trusting, and her beauty, similar to Rena's but with a shapelier figure, would undoubtedly attract attention. After starting her classes, Nephi mentioned that everyone was very nice. She even began having coffee with a guy named Brandon from one of her classes. A week later, Brandon invited her to a concert on Friday night, and Nephi was thrilled. I still felt uneasy and urged Rena to talk to her again. "Don't worry, she knows," Rena assured me, but I felt like a father on prom night, anxious and restless. That night, as I was finally drifting off to sleep, Rena's phone rang. She jumped up, and I followed closely behind. It was Nephi, and I could sense something was off. "We'll be right there," Rena said, glancing at the clock, 1:07 a.m. We picked Nephi up outside a convenience store not far from campus. Rena cautioned me not to bombard her with questions. We could wait until morning. Nephi's distress was clear on her face. We got home, and thankfully, I fell asleep quickly. In the morning, Rena asked me to run some errands because she wanted to talk to Nephi alone. I returned mid-morning, and things seemed normal around the house. I didn't get a chance to find out what had happened until later. Finally, Nephi went to bed early on Saturday night, and Rena and I took a walk as the sun was setting. Here's what she told me. The date started fine. They went to a store and bought some beer. Brandon was old enough to purchase it. Nephi just sipped hers. Eventually, they went to the concert, which Nephi said was fun. Brandon had been behaving like a gentleman up to that point. After the concert ended, Brandon told Nephi he wanted to show her the view from Glazing Ridge. Nephi wondered how much of a view they would get at night, but there was no reason for her to be overly concerned. When they got there, Brandon pulled out a marijuana cigarette, but Nephi declined. After smoking, he started kissing her, and at first, she didn't mind. She kind of liked him. But then things escalated. He unzipped his pants and made a move she wasn't comfortable with. Nephi told him no and asked to go home. He agreed and was pleasant enough on the way back to town. However, he stopped again on a dark street and made another inappropriate request. Once more, Nephi said no, got out of the car, and walked to a mini-mart to call Rena. This was exactly what I had feared, innocent young Nephi being exposed to the advances of a pushy college guy. "What are we going to do?" I asked Rena, troubled. "We're not going to do anything," she said calmly. "As women, we've all experienced this in some way. We have to be cautious about who we trust with our bodies. It's part of growing up." I hesitated, then asked, "Does that mean you went through this with guys before me?" We hadn't really discussed past relationships much. "That's not your business," she said firmly, stopping in her tracks. I paused, processing what she'd said. She noticed and, smiling, grabbed my hand. "Just know this," she said, "the only person who has me now is you." She playfully pressed against me, and while I wasn't entirely satisfied with her response, I decided to drop the subject. The rest of the summer was peaceful. Nephi showed no signs of being affected by the date with Brandon, and we never heard from him again. We spent time showing Nephi around while the weather was nice, took a long weekend trip to Benton, and Nephi got to meet my family. It seemed like she was enjoying America, and as we prepared for the fall term, everything felt like it was falling into place. As for Claude, he was still fuming. How had that scrawny guy beaten him so badly? He was determined to get some payback, he just wasn't sure when. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to vent about how her ex-husband had abandoned her. Sure, she had been involved with Jerome and maybe one other guy at the time, but she still felt like she deserved some fun before settling down for good. Claude thought he had tried everything with his new wife, but she was too clever. He needed to find a way to get back at the man who had embarrassed him and hurt his pride. "I've got to be careful," Claude reminded himself. "I don't want to end up in jail again." He decided to put his sources to work, hoping something would turn up. As for me, I was busy with a full course load that fall term. Rena had earned her accreditation as a registered nurse and was working full-time at the campus clinic. She'd also gotten her driver's license, and we bought her a used car. Nephi was also taking a full load of classes, and Rena and I would see her occasionally on campus throughout the week. There was no further mention of Brandon, though I knew Rena and Nephi had discussed the complexities of dating. When I asked Rena about it, she only said, "Nephi is young, attractive, and healthy. She'll have her own experiences. After all, she's 19, not a child." I agreed, though I was still concerned. Nephi had led a much more sheltered life, and that worried me. For a while, the conversation at home focused entirely on classes, homework, and life at Taft. I didn't hear anything about dates or boyfriends from Nephi, but one day, I saw her at the campus coffee shop with a group of people. I thought I recognized one of them but wasn't sure. The following week, as we were preparing for dinner, I noticed Rena had only set the table for two. "Isn't Nephi eating with us tonight?" I asked. "She called," Rena replied. "She's out with friends, and they're getting something to eat in town." "Is this a date?" I hesitantly asked. Rena smiled. "She's making friends. That's normal. At some point, she'll have a boyfriend, and it will be fine." I knew she was right, but Nephi was so innocent. I didn't want her to get hurt. Over the next few weeks, we saw less of her, as she was spending more time with a group of students from Taft. Rena had met them and assured me they seemed like regular, nice people. "Is she dating anyone in particular?" I asked, my protective instincts kicking in. "Not really, at least not yet. There's one guy, a bit older, in his mid-20s, working his way through school, who Nephi seems to like." A few weeks later, Rena told me Nephi was going out to dinner with him. "He's picking her up here Friday night," she said. "You'll get to meet him." I was surprised and concerned when I recognized Nephi's date. It was Dennis Libby, a bartender I'd met before. Alarm bells went off. We hadn't heard from Jasmine or her brother since the incident at the tennis courts, and I had hoped they were out of our lives for good. But now, someone from their circle was seeing Nephi. "Nice to see you, Owen," Dennis smiled and shook my hand. I knew I needed to have a conversation with him before they left, but I also knew Rena might think I was being overprotective if I pressed too hard. Fortunately, Nephi wasn't ready yet, and I seized the opportunity. "Dennis," I said casually, "let me show you our garden out back." As we walked, I turned to him. "I'm a little concerned about your friendship with Nephi," I said. He stopped, looking puzzled. "Why?" he asked. I explained my past with Jasmine and Claude, and that I had reasons to be wary of anyone connected to them. "My marriage to Jasmine didn't end well," I told him. "Yeah, I've heard a little about that," he said. "But I don't really see them anymore. I mostly work at the coffee shop now, not in the bar, and Claude and Jasmine rarely show up there." I nodded, relieved by what he said. "Just be careful with Nephi," I added. "She means a lot to her sister and me." Dennis nodded earnestly. "I really like her, Owen," he said. After they left, I thought about Dennis. He seemed like a decent guy, hardworking, polite, and trying to put himself through school. There was nothing wrong with him aside from his past association with Jasmine and Claude. I decided not to hold that against him. Nephi and Dennis began seeing each other more regularly, and while I didn't ask about the intimate details of their relationship, it was clear that Nephi was happy, and Dennis seemed to genuinely care about her. For now, I felt like I didn't need to worry about that part of her life. But as life carried on, another complication arose. One of the lower-level employees at Papaya excitedly ran up to the back table where Claude and Armin sat. Claude looked up, irritated by the interruption. "What the hell do you want?" Claude scowled at the young man. "The woman you were asking about, the one married to Jasmine's ex-husband, the Chinese woman," the young man panted, barely containing his excitement. Claude studied him, finally understanding. "Yeah, I know who you're talking about. What about her?" "She was just at the coffee shop," the young man explained, pointing over his shoulder. "She left with Dennis." "Dennis?" Claude questioned. "You sure?" The young man nodded eagerly. Claude thought for a moment while the kid hovered nearby, waiting for praise. Finally, Claude pulled a couple of bills from his pocket and stuffed them into the young man's shirt. "You did good, now beat it," Claude commanded. As the kid ran off, Claude sat back and thought. What was Dennis doing with Owen's wife? Could the kid really have seen that? He definitely saw something, Claude concluded. Dennis had worked at Papaya for a long time and was close to graduating now, mostly working at the coffee shop. Claude noted that Dennis had started acting like he was distancing himself from the old Papaya crowd. "Armin," Claude called, "find someone reliable to keep an eye on Dennis Libby." Armin nodded, understanding the assignment. Meanwhile, I noticed that Nephi and Dennis were spending more and more time together. It wasn't unusual for the four of us to share meals, though Dennis never stayed the night, and Nephi hadn't spent the entire night with him either. Still, she would occasionally come home late. By late fall, things seemed to be going well. Rena and I were happy, and Nephi seemed content too, which lifted the mood of the entire household. I had nearly forgotten about the unpleasantness with Claude and Jasmine. It felt like they were out of our lives for good. Later that week, Claude sat in a booth, quietly waiting for a report. He had been thinking more and more about Owen, the way he disrespected Jasmine, the encounter at the tennis court. Claude was determined to get even. "It turns out that's not Owen's wife, but his wife's sister," Armin began. "The sister and Libby are together, a couple." Claude pondered the information. Maybe this was the opportunity he needed. "What else?" Claude asked. "Any details about the sister or Libby?" "Not much, but my guy noticed that on some Tuesdays and Thursdays, the sister meets Libby at the coffee shop when he's off at 6, Armin explained. "Interesting," Claude muttered, tapping his finger thoughtfully against his lips. Back on campus, Nephi called out to Rena as she headed to class. "I'm meeting Dennis tonight for dinner. I'll be home later." Nephi had 2 afternoon classes, then planned to study at the library before walking over to the coffee shop to meet Dennis when he finished his shift. As she walked, Nephi felt happy and at peace. She was attending college, had a great relationship with Dennis, and was living with her sister. Life in America seemed wonderful, and she was grateful. Meanwhile, Claude was making his own preparations. "You got the stuff?" Claude asked Armin. Armin nodded. He was behind the bar, filling in for a missing bartender. Beneath the counter, in a small dish, lay crushed white tablets. Armin had used these before. He knew the right dose to make someone woozy, without completely knocking them out. He smiled to himself, thinking about how often he had practiced. Just then, Claude's phone rang. He listened quietly and then disconnected. "Is she coming?" Jasmine whispered. She had been sitting at the bar but was told to wait upstairs to avoid arousing Dennis's suspicion. "Yeah, she's coming," Claude replied. "Now get lost," he ordered. Jasmine knew the plan and headed upstairs to Claude's office. When Nephi arrived at the coffee shop, a large American man reached the door at the same time. He held it open for her politely. "Thank you," she smiled as they both entered. Inside, Dennis was preparing the clothes for the night. The large man called out, "Dennis. Good to see you," before engaging in light conversation. "Come on, let me buy you a drink," the man said casually. "I don't know," Dennis hesitated, glancing at Nephi. "It's just a drink, no harm in that," the man replied smoothly. Then, turning toward Nephi with a warm smile, he extended his hand. Claude Francis reached out to shake Nephi's hand, his large hand engulfing hers. "How about just one quick drink, then you're on your way," he said with a friendly smile at both her and Dennis. Dennis glanced at Nephi, and she nodded with a bit of enthusiasm. The man seemed nice, she thought. They made their way to the large bar behind the coffee shop. "Come on, let's all sit at the bar," Claude suggested cheerfully, playfully clapping Dennis on the back. "Armin," he called to the bartender, "how about that new IPA we just got on tap?" He turned to Nephi. "You like beer, don't you?" She nodded, and Armin poured 3 large glasses of the strong, bitter brew. "Cheers!" Claude motioned to the group, and they clinked glasses. Nephi noticed the beer was much stronger than she was used to, but she took a few sips anyway. Claude encouraged them to keep drinking, lifting his glass and repeated toasts. As the evening wore on, Nephi began to feel lightheaded, her words slurring slightly. Dennis, too, looked confused and uneasy. A few minutes later, Nephi started to slump on her stool. Claude knew he needed to move them before anyone noticed. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" he asked Nephi quietly. She sat for a moment, then nodded weakly. Claude gestured to Armin. "Let's take them upstairs where they'll have more privacy." Nephi nodded again, her head drooping as Claude and Armin gently helped her and Dennis up the back stairs that led to Claude's office, a converted apartment with a couple of bedrooms. By the time they got to the top, both Nephi and Dennis were barely conscious. Armin and Claude helped them into one of the rooms and laid them on the bed. Just then, Jasmine appeared. "I'll take Dennis," she said, moving to help him into the other room. Claude and Armin turned their attention to Nephi, while Jasmine disappeared with Dennis. Meanwhile, back at home, I arrived around 5:30, and Rena was already in the kitchen making dinner. "Is Nephi joining us tonight?" I called out. "Not tonight," Rena responded. "She and Dennis are having dinner in town." Later that evening, around 8:30, Rena glanced outside as the headlights of a passing car briefly lit up the windows. She looked at her watch. "I better check in with Nephi," she said softly, then dialed her phone. It went to voicemail. "Hey, sis, just checking in. Call me if you need anything," I overheard her say. As the night wore on, there was still no word from Nephi. By the time I was getting ready for bed, Rena seemed more concerned. "No word from Nephi?" I asked. "No," Rena replied. "I thought she would have called by now." I shrugged. "Maybe her phone died," I suggested. "Yeah, maybe," Rena answered, but there was a hint of worry in her voice. I went to bed, but later that night, Rena woke me up. "Owen," she whispered, "it's almost midnight. I've called Nephi 3 times, and I even tried Dennis. I haven't heard anything from either of them. I'm getting worried." I sat up, still half asleep. "When was the last time you tried?" I asked, fully waking up now. I half expected them to walk through the door any moment, but that didn't happen. "Why don't we wait another hour or so, and if we haven't heard anything, I'll drive over to Dennis's," I suggested. When we still hadn't heard anything by 1 a.m., I headed out into the night. Rena stayed home in case they came back. I went to Dennis's apartment, but it was dark, and no one answered when I knocked for several minutes. I checked the parking lot but didn't see Dennis's car. I called Rena to give her a quick update and told her I would drive around town to look for them. The town was quiet, especially since it wasn't the weekend. The downtown bars were mostly empty, and there was no sign of Dennis's car on the street. I considered checking the parking garages but decided against it. It was too big a task. When Rena called again, I could hear the alarm in her voice as she asked if I'd found anything. I told her to stay home while I went back to wait at Dennis's apartment. By then, it was after 2 a.m. I parked outside and waited, dozing off briefly. I woke up with a start, my neck stiff from the uncomfortable angle. I checked my watch, 5:07 a.m. I quickly got out of the car and went back to Dennis's apartment. It looked as undisturbed as before. I was pretty sure no one would answer, so I texted Rena and told her I was heading home. We needed to decide what to do next. On the drive back, I couldn't stop worrying. Where could Nephi be? What's our next step? Was she still with Dennis? These thoughts swirled in my head as I turned onto our street. That's when I saw an odd shape on the curb, several houses down. I slowed down and, as I got closer, realized it was a person. I pulled over, heart racing, and ran to the figure. That long dark hair, it was Nephi. She was lying on the curb, breathing but disheveled, her hair a tangled mess. Her clothes were missing, and she looked as if she'd been through something terrible. Nephi! I shook her gently. She didn't move at first. I tried again, calling her name louder this time. Slowly, her eyes opened, and her lips moved weakly. Suddenly, she came to life, screaming, "No, no," and flailing her arms. "Nephi, it's Owen!" I said softly, trying to calm her. Gradually, she focused on me, realizing where she was. Looking down at her bare body, she hurriedly covered up, and I gave her my coat. She began to shiver. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice trembling. Then, without warning, she burst into tears. I quickly called Rena to explain the situation and got Nephi into my car. She was shaking uncontrollably, so I turned the heat on full blast. Rena arrived a few minutes later, and we drove home together. Once home, Nephi insisted on taking a shower. Rena tried gently to ask her what had happened, but all Nephi could say was, "I don't know." She repeated it over and over. Rena sat with her while she took a long, hot shower, hoping Nephi would open up, but she couldn't get much more from her. I waited in the kitchen, anxiously. "Did she say anything?" I asked when Rena came back. "Not really," Rena replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "It looks like she may have been drugged. Every time I ask her to remember, she gets upset and starts crying." Seeing Rena's tears turn into full sobs, I hugged her. She was grieving for her younger sister, feeling helpless. Suddenly, it hit me. "Where's Dennis?" I said aloud. Rena took a deep breath and, wiping her cheeks, suggested it might be best if she and Nephi had some time alone. She thought it would help if I tried to find Dennis. I got back into the car and returned to Dennis's apartment. It still looked the same, empty and quiet. Frustration and anger bubbled inside me. Something bad had happened to Nephi, and I needed answers. I called Dennis. No answer. As I sat there, my mind began to race. Could Dennis have been part of some kind of twisted plot with Claude and Jasmine? Had he been complicit the whole time? My phone buzzed, breaking my thoughts. This time, Dennis answered, his voice groggy and confused. "Dennis, it's Owen," I barked into the phone. "Where the hell are you?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. I'm not sure," he stammered. "Who is this?" "It's Owen," I shouted. "Nephi's home, and she's not okay." "Where are you?" "What happened last night?" Dennis sounded disoriented but told me he thought he was in one of the downtown parking garages. He had no idea how he'd gotten there. I told him to head home, and I'd meet him at his apartment. When he finally showed up, he looked as disheveled as Nephi had, though he was dressed. I had little sympathy for him. Nephi had been in danger, and something terrible had happened to her. Dennis, clearly upset, explained what little he remembered. He and Nephi had planned to have dinner, and she was supposed to meet him at the coffee shop where he worked. "That's when Claude showed up," he said. "And then what?" I asked, my anger rising. He told me they had gone with Claude to Papaya for a drink, but the next thing he remembered was waking up in his car in the parking garage. He couldn't recall anything in between. I sat there in his dark apartment, processing what I had learned. Claude, still holding a grudge, had lured Dennis and Nephi into Papaya. He likely drugged them, and I didn't even want to imagine what might have happened to Nephi. My anger was initially directed at Dennis, and I told him how irresponsible he had been. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really his fault. Slowly, my frustration shifted to Claude, and possibly Jasmine. As I left, Dennis asked, "Can I see Nephi?" "No!" I shouted and stormed out. I called Rena, who said Nephi was resting. I told her I would be home soon. Rena explained that Nephi had recounted a similar story to what Dennis had told me. Based on Rena's medical knowledge, it seemed they might have been given some kind of drug. The nausea, confusion, and memory gaps all fit the pattern. I hesitated, but I had to ask, does Nephi think anything inappropriate happened to her? Rena's face grew somber, silent tears trailing down her cheeks. She nodded, her shoulders trembling with grief. I went to her and held her as she broke down. After a long pause, Rena finally spoke. She doesn't remember much, but there are signs, bruising in areas that could indicate something did happen. I examined her, but we need to take her to the hospital. They'll check for more and give her the necessary treatments, including the morning after pill. At that point, the police will likely get involved. I was furious. I had no doubt Claude was behind this. Forgiveness, which had been ingrained in me since childhood, was no longer an option. My rage was consuming me. Later, Rena and Nephi went to the hospital, and I was told to stay behind. They were gone for most of the afternoon. When they returned, Nephi went straight to her room, looking broken, her usual light extinguished. Rena shared that the hospital ran tests for diseases, and Nephi took the pill to prevent pregnancy. The police had also taken her statement, but there wasn't much evidence. With no DNA and Nephi's memory impaired, it was hard for them to build a case. As I processed the helplessness of the situation, Rena got on the phone and began speaking in Indonesian. She was talking to Bakti. Later, she came into the kitchen and told me, "Bakti and Vi are coming. They're coming to be with Nephi and take her back home." That was it. My guilt, sadness, and anger boiled over. Grabbing my keys, I stormed out. "Owen, where are you going?" Rena called after me, but I didn't reply. I had one destination in mind, Papaya. Even through my fury, I tried to stay focused. I needed to confront Claude, to look him in the eyes and see the guilt. I had to decide what to do next. When I walked into Papaya, it still looked and smelled the same as years ago. I spotted him almost immediately, Claude, sitting with his smug demeanor in the same booth where he used to sit. I marched straight up to him. "What did you do? What did you give her?" I demanded, catching him off guard. Well, if it isn't my ex-brother-in-law." "How's your tennis game?" he replied with that same fake smile I had seen too many times before. "Cut the crap, Claude. The police are involved." "What did you do?" I demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied calmly, that same fake expression plastered on his face, trying to play innocent. We went back and forth for several minutes, me accusing, and Claude pretending to be unaware of anything. Armin sat quietly nearby, smirking. My frustration built, and images of Nephi, young, vulnerable, flashed through my mind. After one particularly rude comment from Claude, my anger peaked. I grabbed an empty beer bottle, gripping it like a weapon. I raised it, ready to lash out. But then, Armin casually slid a newspaper off the table, revealing a matte black pistol beneath. The unspoken threat was crystal clear. I froze. "Owen," Claude spoke with feigned patience, "I think it's time for you to go home. It's better for everyone that way." His voice dripped with false concern. I stood there, boiling with rage but powerless, the weight of Armin's gun neutralizing any action I had planned. I glared at Claude, feeling more hatred than I had ever known. Finally, I turned to leave. "Remember, Owen," Claude called out as I was walking away, "it's a jungle out there." Laughter echoed behind me, mocking. Just before I reached the door, one last comment froze me in my tracks. "Tell Nephi hello from us. She sure is a fun girl." More laughter followed as I exited the building, my fists clenched in fury. When I pulled up to the house, I had to sit in the car for a few moments to calm down. My anger toward Claude was overwhelming, and I was frustrated with the police for their lack of action. But most of all, I was angry at myself for failing to protect Nephi. I felt like I had let her down. Inside, I was relieved to see Nephi sitting with Rena, watching TV, looking almost normal. Rena and I exchanged a glance, but no words. I didn't want to tell her I had seen Claude. It would only make her worry more. Later, after Nephi had gone to bed, Rena and I spoke. Bhakti and Vi will be here the day after tomorrow, she said quietly. I nodded, but inside I was nervous. Would they be angry with me for letting this happen? Would they want Rena to go back with them? Would they think I couldn't take care of her? For the next few days, these thoughts kept swirling in my mind. The silver lining was that Nephi seemed to be slowly recovering. We had kept Dennis away, though he kept calling. When Bhakti and Vi arrived, it was their first time in America, so for a day or two, we showed them around as if this were a normal visit. On the third night, Bhakti asked me to go on a walk with him. I knew this conversation was coming, and in a strange way, I was almost relieved. As we walked, Bhakti finally spoke. Owen, why don't the American police put these men in jail? I tried to explain the system, about evidence and how people are innocent until proven guilty. But even I didn't believe what I was saying. Bhakti walked in silence for a while, his hands clasped behind his back, his head down, absorbing my words. Finally, he said, "So, the police, no help?" I shook my head. He walked quietly a bit longer. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "Owen, these men must pay." I nodded silently. Revenge felt like the only option. After a long pause, Bhakti asked, "You believe Dennis will help us?" "I do," I replied. "Have Dennis come see us tomorrow," he said. "I have a plan. We need him." Curious, I asked, "What's the plan?" Bhakti began telling me about an old strategy from his village. "You remember how we dealt with those rebels who attacked Rena's family," he said. "We lured them in, made them think they were going to take more girls from the village. But instead of girls, they found men waiting for them." As we approached the house, Bhakti stopped and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mimble is Dendam," he said, his voice steady. I stood there for a moment, the meaning sinking in, Mimble is revenge. The next day, while Rena and Nephi went to the city, Bhakti, Vi, Dennis, and I sat and planned. Bhakti laid out his strategy, a trap for Claude and the others. To me, it seemed like a long shot, but Bhakti was confident. He didn't know Claude, Jasmine, Armin, or whoever else was involved, but he believed in his plan. "Don't worry, Owen," he reassured me. "I've planned everything." One thing working in our favor was Dennis's guilt and determination to help. He truly felt awful about what had happened that night, and his involvement was key to making the plan work. "Nephi, Vi, and I will leave in 3 days, Bhakti said. "We'll wait for everything to fall into place." Dennis, meanwhile, walked into Papaya like it was any other day, even though the place now felt tainted to him. His anger about what happened to Nephi was nearly as high as Owen's, but it was critical for him to play his role. He had to tamp down his emotions and act the way Baki had coached him to. Slowly, Dennis approached the back booth where Claude sat, no Armin this time. Dennis tried to assume a natural, friendly smile, and he felt he was pulling it off. "Hey, Claude," he addressed the big man. Claude was startled at first, unsure of Dennis's intentions. "Hey, Denny," Claude replied, a slight smile appearing on his face. "Where have you been?" I've been around, hanging out with Nephi," Dennis said, playing his role. "She's quite the lady." Claude, still wary, nodded in agreement. They talked for a few minutes about different things before Dennis brought the conversation back to Nephi. "Not exactly sure what happened the other night," Dennis said, shaking his head with a grin. "But Nephi seemed to enjoy herself." Claude seemed intrigued. "We could probably make something like that happen again," Claude suggested, hopeful. Dennis almost lost his composure but kept up the act, maintaining control. He explained to Claude that Nephi's elderly uncle had taken her back home to Indonesia. "Too bad," Dennis said. "She keeps texting me about how much she enjoyed the other night and wants to meet up again." Whatever had happened, Nephi seemed eager for more. Claude, surprised, hadn't expected that. You never know, thought Claude. Maybe she was more into it than I thought. I might have to figure out a way to meet up with her again. Dennis left shortly after, but Claude kept thinking about Nephi. She was attractive, and he started imagining ways to see her again, chuckling to himself at the thought. How'd it go? I asked Dennis. In my opinion, mission accomplished, Dennis replied. I think he believed me, and he's definitely interested in Nephi. His ego got the better of him. I considered Dennis's words. I agreed with Dennis about Claude Francis's ego. He thought he was some kind of ladies' man. To be fair, he did attract some good-looking women, but they always seemed a bit shallow, not like Nephi. Okay, I said. Let's move into phase 2, the text messages. We'll start sending them tomorrow. You try to get close to Claude and gauge his reactions. Remember, Dennis, your role is critical. Got it, he replied. The next day, Dennis sent a text. Hey, it's Nephi. How are you? My uncle brought me home. They thought I was getting into trouble in America. Claude could hardly believe he received a text from Owen's wife's sister. He decided to play it cool and see what unfolded. Hi, sweetheart. Too bad you're clear across the world. We could have some fun together. A few minutes later, Claude got another message. I know I'm mad at my uncle. He thinks I'm still a child. I can do grown-up things. In fact, last night I thought about doing some grown-up things with you. Claude's interest peaked. What kind of grown-up things, sweetheart? The flirtatious texts continued. Rena and Vic were crafting the messages, running them by Dennis and Owen to ensure they aligned with their strategy. The next step involved pictures. They had a few of Nephi's face, but the others were of Rena. They planned to send these out to Claude along with suggestive messages about what he could do with each image, pretending they were of Nephi. Reports from Dennis indicated the messages were having the desired effect on Claude. The texts and pictures continued for a few days, exciting Claude, but his longing for Nephi grew stronger. The more messages he received, the more he craved her attention. Then came phase 3, dialing up the pressure. Hey Claude, good news. My uncle has to go help one of his cousins on their farm next month. I'll be all alone for 3 weeks. Please come visit me. At first, Claude dismissed the idea, but then it struck him. He recalled a previous trip to Bangkok with Armin and how much fun they had. This time would be different, though. He was intrigued. That sounds interesting. Mind if I bring a couple of friends? He texted back, still unsure if he would actually go, but the idea was tempting. Several days passed before she replied, of course. The more, the merrier. Yes, please come and bring friends. I'll send you pictures of my friends who will party with us. That night, Claude received a picture of 4 attractive Asian women smiling and waving, all dressed in somewhat revealing outfits. These weren't Nephi's friends, they were actually models from Jakarta. Vic had selected the most appealing photos he could find and paid for them. Armin, Claude said, showing him the pictures. Take a look at this. Claude and Armin discussed the trip, both beginning to get on board with the idea of another adventure to Asia, this time with more casual encounters rather than hired help. What are you guys talking about? Jasmine asked, approaching them. Claude explained the plan, and Jasmine interjected, I get to go too. After all, it's my husband we're getting back at. She glanced at the texts. A couple of those girls looked pretty attractive. Claude raised an eyebrow. Are you serious? Just curious, she replied. Sometimes I get tired of the same old thing. Claude shook his head, exchanging a look with Armin, who shrugged. Okay, Jasmine said, give me the dates and airports, and I'll look into flights. This plan was actually coming together, I thought. According to Dennis and based on the texts from Nephi, it was actually Vic who was fielding the messages from Claude. They were set to be in BMA on the 18th of next month, so we needed to arrive by the 16th. Rena spent several hours making flight arrangements for us. The good news was that the plan was working. The bad news was Nephi was struggling with post-traumatic stress from the attack. She wanted the life she was starting in America, but the trauma left her feeling frightened and depressed. We needed to get revenge for the brutal attack, *Mimble as Dendam star. Before long, Rena and I were back in BMA. As we deplaned, the sounds, sights, and smells were distinctly familiar, reminding me of when I first arrived in Indonesia. But I didn't have time for nostalgia. We had a plan to execute. Yes, execute was a fitting word for it. The familiarity of the fuzzy home where Vic, Nephi, and Baki lived was comforting. We shared a nice meal together before Nephi prepared to stay at the Effendi residence. The older Effendi brother drove over in their flatbed farm truck to pick her up. I walked Nephi to the truck and hugged her goodbye. "I'm so sorry," I told her. "Owen, I just don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I felt my own eyes welling up, but that emotion quickly shifted from sorrow to anger. "I'll take care of her," I promised. The text messages continued back and forth, with Vic and Rena editing them to ensure Claude didn't back out. The morning of their arrival was busy. We planned to turn the fuzzy house into a trap, with Rena pretending to be Nephi as bait. That part made me the most nervous. Baki noticed my anxiety. "Owen," he said, his forehead dipping to touch mine as I sat, "the plan will work out. No one from our family will be hurt. Trust the plan." Part of that plan was for Nephi or Rena to be minimally dressed when they arrived. This was to ensure their focus was distracted as they approached the house. Rena was modest around Vic and Baki, but the time for embarrassment had passed. All preparations were complete. We waited in an outbuilding about 20 yards from the house. Vic was inside, in a small room off the kitchen, ready to signal us when he received word of their arrival. It was mid-afternoon, their flight had landed at 1:20 p.m., and we knew it would take time for them to deplane, collect their luggage, and get the rental car. Baki and I waited in the shed. I was nervous, but Baki seemed unflappably calm. As the clock ticked past 3 o'clock, we received a message from Vic that they were on their way. My nerves ramped up. Soon, we saw the telltale dust of an approaching vehicle, signaling Rena to come out onto the shaded porch. Through a gap in the shed, I caught sight of the metallic silver Honda Brio pulling up in front of the fuzzy house. Rena posed as Nephi, smiling and waving as she entered the house. "Hi! Come on in," she called, her presence captivating. Through the cracks, we saw Claude, and then Armin emerged from the Brio. To my surprise, Jasmine got out as well. For a moment, I questioned if we were doing the right thing, but then I thought of poor Nephi and what she had endured. My doubts vanished. "Be ready," Baki said, clasping my forearm. Seeing the scene unfold, Claude and Armin nearly sprinted toward the house, while Jasmine approached more cautiously. We emerged from the shed just as Jasmine was entering the house. She must have heard us, stopping short at the sight of me. "Claude," she cried. "It's a trap." We rushed toward the house, and chaos erupted as Vic struggled momentarily with Armin. Jasmine turned toward me, anger etched on her face, ready to confront me. Though I could have easily overpowered her, my deep-seated principles about not hitting a woman held me back. Meanwhile, I saw Claude bolt out the front door. Between him and the rental car stood Baki. I was still struggling with Jasmine, but my focus was on the commotion outside as Claude approached Baki. Claude was bigger and stronger, clearly younger, but what he didn't know was that Baki was skilled in several martial arts. Claude rushed straight at Baki, who quickly grabbed his wrist, twisted, and pivoted, soon bringing Claude to the ground in a hold that left him incapacitated. Claude yelled and swore, threatening us with revenge. Vic emerged and quickly secured Jasmine with heavy-duty duct tape. I glanced inside to see that Armin had already been taped roughly. Vic shoved Jasmine to the ground and approached Claude, who was still pinned by Baki. Vic had been informed about the attack on Nephi, and Baki, protective of his younger cousin, was determined to hold Claude accountable. I watched as Vic unhurriedly walked up to Claude and delivered a decisive kick to his jaw, knocking him out. With all three of them secured, we needed to wait until it got darker for the next phase of our plan. Baki motioned for Vic to remove the gags from our captives' mouths. Immediately, Jasmine began screaming for help. "Put the gag back on her," Baki said firmly. Jasmine sputtered and struggled as Vic aggressively regagged her. Baki settled on a stool in front of them, leaning forward with his hands on his knees, a neutral expression masking the intensity beneath. "Why did you hurt Nephi?" he asked, searching Claude and Armin's faces for answers. "We didn't do anything. Let us go. We're American citizens. You have to release us." Claude blustered. "You will be released," Baki assured them, "but first tell me why you hurt my niece." After some back and forth, Claude finally admitted, she liked it. A near smile crossed his face. Vic, angered by the remark, started to rise, but Baki restrained him. "You gave her drugs and used her," Baki pressed. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with them denying wrongdoing while Baki calmly sought a confession. Claude maintained his bravado, demanding to be let free. As we neared the end of the questioning, Baki asked one last question. "Do you think it's okay to attack a young girl, take her clothes, and throw her out like garbage in a strange land?" Claude replied almost casually, "She had a good time." "So what if we forgot her clothes?" "She got home, didn't she?" Baki's expression shifted. I had never seen his kind face transform like that before. "Put the gags back on them," he instructed as he turned away. We piled the three of them into the back of a large van-like vehicle. Claude, Armin, and Jasmine were secured and gagged with duct tape, and ropes held them in place. Baki drove while Rena followed in the rental car, and Vic and I kept watch over our captives. The vehicle rumbled over the rough roads of Simba Island, which were mostly deserted at this hour. Eventually, we arrived at a small harbor. While we waited in the vehicle, Baki got out and walked down to the docks. He was gone for about 45 minutes. When he returned, he motioned for us to bring the captives. Earlier, Rena had parked the rental car at the crowded lot adjacent to the terminal, blending into the shadows in her dark clothing. 15 minutes later, she was picked up outside the terminal by Eka Effendi, who brought her back to Nephi's house. As the dilapidated boat chugged out of the harbor with its running lights on, our captives remained bound and gagged below deck. I felt a wave of nausea from the choppy waves, the stress of the day, and the mingling odors of diesel and fish. Baki's cousin piloted the boat in silence the entire time we were on the water, never looking at our captives or me. The only interaction I noticed was Baki speaking softly to him, receiving a brief nod just before we docked. Once we arrived, Baki had us remove the gags and gave each of the captives a bottle of water. This also gave Jasmine a chance to speak. "Owen, please," she begged. "Let me go. I didn't do anything, it was those two." She nodded toward Claude and Armin. "Shut up," Claude bellowed. "You're both going to get gagged again if you keep talking." "Owen," Jasmine whispered urgently, "please, if I ever meant anything to you, I beg you." I tried to summon a memory of happier times with Jasmine, but every flash of our past was eclipsed by the image of poor Nephi, vulnerable and hurt. "You will all be freed soon," I said. "It won't be long." I turned and climbed the ladder to the deck, tired of the sight of them. We waited in the dark on the primitive dock until we heard the sputtering noise of a large vehicle approaching. Baki, Vic, and I unbound our captives' legs, allowing them to walk. They seemed eager to escape the cramped boat, though their pace was tentative as we marched them up the steps toward the rumbling vehicle. We muscled them into the back of the truck, tying them to the uprights. Their legs were rebound with duct tape, and a large piece of burlap was placed over them and secured to the truck. I took a step back to examine the scene. With our passengers tied up, they resembled cargo, and I doubted we would encounter anyone else on this journey. Just in case, I climbed into the flatbed as well. Vic drove while Baki navigated, and we set off slowly on the rough pathway. I knew from speaking with Baki that the road would only worsen the further we traveled. Progress was slow, and a few times we had to stop the vehicle to clear away fallen trees and other obstructions. "Be careful," Vic said. "Check for snakes." His serious tone reminded me of the potential dangers lurking in the jungle around us. I glanced at the dense foliage, fully aware that we were deep in a remote area. After about an hour, the vehicle stopped. Sunlight began to filter through the canopy of trees above as we sat in the clearing, surrounded by the sounds of the tropical rainforest. Baki and Vic emerged from the cab, and Baki spread a worn tarp on the ground. One by one, we brought the three captives, still gagged and blindfolded, out onto the tarp. Vic then took out a long, sharp knife and, with careful precision, cut away their bindings. As he removed their duct tape and blindfolds, I caught a glimpse of Jasmine. The sight momentarily stirred old memories of our early days together, but I quickly pushed those thoughts aside. The image of Nephi's suffering was far more compelling, reaffirming my resolve. It took a moment for the captives to adjust to the brightness of their surroundings. As they breathed deeply, they began to take in the towering trees and dense vegetation, their initial shock giving way to fear. Baki crouched in front of them, his usual pleasant demeanor tempered by the seriousness of the situation. "What are you going to do with us?" Claude bellowed, anger lacing his voice. Armin and Jasmine echoed his demand, seeking answers about where they were and when they would return. Baki, still smiling, nodded thoughtfully. Finally, he replied, "Okay, I will answer your questions. You ask what we are doing with you? We are letting you go, just like you asked." "And where are we?" He gestured widely. "We are on Dragon Island." I could see one by one they began to understand their fate, and then the negotiating started. "I can get you $100,000 within 24 hours, Claude offered. When there was no reply, he raised it to $200, now begging. "Please, please, please." Jasmine sobbed, while Armin nodded toward Claude, claiming it was his idea. I wanted no part in their bargaining, which triggered a heated exchange between Claude and Armin as Jasmine continued to weep. This went on for some time with no effect on any of us. Finally, Vic tossed each of them a bottle of water as we prepared to leave. "Why do it like this?" Claude asked, gesturing to their surroundings. Vic, now standing tall and serious, addressed Claude directly. "You abused my niece," he said. "You left her without clothes in a foreign land. That's what you did to her." Any trace of Baki's calm demeanor vanished. "Now we're doing the same to you." "Why?" Claude was becoming frantic. Baki turned toward him. "Do you read the Bible?" he asked. Claude fell silent. "In Leviticus, it says, 'Eye for eye, tooth for tooth,'" Baki continued. He threw an ancient, rusty knife onto the tarp. "Here's a knife. Help yourselves to untie." It would take them some time to cut through the duct tape, and with that, we began to climb back into the vehicle. "Wait, wait," shouted Claude. "What is Dragon Island? Where are we?" "You're on Komodo Island," Vic told them. "Home to the Komodo dragon. The largest lizard on Earth. Be careful, their bite is venomous." As we were getting in the vehicle, Claude yelled, "Please, Owen, please." I looked back at him. "Remember, it's a jungle out there." With that, we drove away. 3 days later, Rena and I were back home. It felt strange that so much had happened in just a week. We didn't speak much about it, focusing instead on reclaiming our lives. Often, during my runs or walks, I reflected on what we had done. The retribution we executed was far removed from what I was taught growing up, morally speaking. But I couldn't summon any guilt. What we did was necessary. I wasn't going to let Nephi live in fear because of Claude and his group, not on my watch. After much discussion, Nephi decided to return to America and stay with us. We assured her that any threats from those who assaulted her were gone. We provided no details, just reassurance. She had said she liked America and wanted to come back. On the evening before Nephi's flight landed, I went out for a walk while Rena prepared her room. My mind began to wander about the entire plan. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to those three. Did they survive? We had heard nothing about Claude, Jasmine, and Armin and hadn't inquired, yet curiosity lingered. Meanwhile, Jasmine and Claude moved slowly through the jungle. "I'm so tired," she thought. At first, they tried to follow the truck's path but quickly got lost in the dense underbrush, unsure of where they were or where to go. "I'm getting eaten alive by bugs," Jasmine lamented, her worries about snakes growing with every step. On their first night, they tried to keep moving in the darkness, searching for any sign of civilization. With only faint moonlight to guide them, they pushed forward. Suddenly, Jasmine heard Armin let out a high-pitched scream. She turned to see him slump to the ground, having encountered a banded snake that slithered away into the underbrush. What Jasmine and the others didn't realize was that this was a banded kite, whose venom is far more potent than that of a king cobra. Armin began to feel the effects of the snake bite almost immediately. For a moment, Jasmine and Claude contemplated staying with their poison companion, but Jasmine quickly realized they had to focus on survival. Without looking back, she and her brother moved deeper into the jungle, leaving Armin behind. Fatigue began to weigh on Claude as well. He stumbled, walking unsteadily. "We need to rest," Jasmine thought. "It's nearly nightfall." She told him they should take a break, and Claude, still reeling, spread out the burlap tarp on the jungle floor and slumped into a fetal position, exhausted. "I better check for snakes," Jasmine thought, scanning the closest vegetation. Jasmine felt the rustling in the undergrowth, aware that many other animals inhabited the jungle. Exhausted, she slumped down on the tarp, resting against Claude's broad back. Suddenly, Claude screamed, jolting her awake. His yell and quick movement startled her, and she saw him kicking at something. At first, she thought it was a snake, but it was much larger. The creature moved away on 4 legs, its gait strange and unsettling. "What was that thing?" Claude shouted, glancing at his foot. "Hell, that hurts." Jasmine looked down and saw Claude's foot was red with blood. It must have bitten him. "Claude, we've got to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. Snakes were one thing, but now this other creature, a dragon, as someone had called it, added to her fear. "Come on, Claude," she urged, picking up the burlap as they continued, aimlessly moving through the thick jungle. The thought of snakes and dragons made each step feel perilous. Jasmine glanced back, realizing Claude was falling behind. "Claude, keep moving," she shouted, but he just nodded. By midday, the heat and humidity were stifling. Jasmine discovered a small creek, the water offering a brief respite from the oppressive air. When Claude finally reached her, she noticed the cause of his delay. He washed away the blood and revealed puncture marks from the creature's bite. His foot was swelling, signs of infection spreading across his skin. They rested for a moment, both dozing off until Jasmine woke, feeling the weight of their dire situation. "Claude, we have to move," she insisted, standing up. Claude looked up, eyes glassy, and shook his head before glancing at his swollen foot. "I'm not going anywhere on this foot," he said. Jasmine examined his injury, realizing how serious it was. "I'll stay here," he added, pain evident in his voice. "You go get help." They shared a quiet understanding, no emotional farewells were needed. Jasmine turned and headed back into the jungle. Back in her normal life, Jasmine was managing her classes and writing a paper on alternative farming methods. Rena continued working at the campus clinic, energized by her role in helping students at Taft University. Their relationship deepened, and Vic's return with Nephi surprised her. She moved her office to a small outdoor building, allowing Vic to have a bedroom in the house. "I was glad he was here, but I felt uncertain about his plans, and suddenly our house seemed a bit crowded." Nephi had bounced back, though there were moments when the effects of her trauma became evident. While we were in town, she would cling to Rena or suddenly burst into tears. We reassured her that she was safe and that the bad people were gone. Speaking of those bad people, I hadn't heard a word about Claude, Jasmine, or Armin. I did learn that Papaya was closed, which raised many questions, but I knew I couldn't show too much interest. Every so often, I found myself thinking about Jasmine. She must have been so tired, her feet had to be aching from the jungle, and her skin was covered in insect bites. Yet, it was the overwhelming fatigue that really struck me. "I need to rest," she must have thought. There was a dry stream bed nearby that looked like a good spot to lay out the tarp. Overwhelmed, she didn't even check for snakes this time and simply placed the tarp down. An odd smell lingered in the air, earthy, mixed with something reminiscent of spoiled food. She glanced around but saw nothing, then lay down, hoping to find help the next day as she drifted off to sleep. Jasmine jolted awake in the early morning light, sensing movement and a horrible smell. Sitting up, her eyes adjusted to see a shape moving quickly toward her. Panic surged, and she jumped up to escape the creature, but in her weakened state, she wasn't fast enough. The Komodo dragon could sprint up to 20 kilometers per hour, and Jasmine had no chance. As it lunged, she screamed as its first bite sank into her calf. Later, I sat in a chair reflecting on my strange experience. If my parents could see me now, they wouldn't believe it. Rena had set up this appointment and convinced me to come in for a manicure. I recalled years ago, working with soil and fertilizers, wondering if the stains on my fingers would ever fade. Now, someone was buffing those same nails. But there had been many changes in my life beyond just that. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It all started nearly 3 months after our trip to Komodo Island. Out of the blue, I received a call from the attorney who had helped me with my divorce, John Scalia. He asked me to meet him at his office. "John, what's this about?" I asked, feeling a mix of curiosity and worry. I just wanted to close that chapter of my life for good. "Owen, it's best if we meet in person." "It's complicated," he replied. We set a time to meet, and when we did, he greeted me with the same serious demeanor I remembered from before. He shook my hand. "This has to do with your ex-wife, Jasmine Duval," he said. Oh great, just when I had started to completely move on. "What about her could possibly involve me?" I asked. "Like I said, it's complicated." Then he told me about the developments. 60 days ago, the Indonesian Forest Service had found the bodies of 3 people on Komodo Island. The island is home to the largest lizard on Earth, the Komodo dragon, and it houses Komodo National Park. Each year, supervised tours lead visitors around the island, though some attempt to break away from their groups in search of the elusive lizards. This is illegal, and most are quickly discovered. Unfortunately, the dolls ventured deep into the jungle, where they were attacked and partially eaten, likely by a Komodo dragon. The Forest Service believed their remains were retrieved, and DNA testing confirmed a 99.8% match to the Duvals. As John paused, I could sense the mixture of emotions in his expression. I absorbed the news, reflecting later that he might have thought my silence stemmed from sorrow over my ex-wife's death, but it wasn't. Finally, I replied, "But John, what does this have to do with me, and why are you involved?" He took a breath. "Let me explain. I was contacted by an attorney in St. Louis. Claude Francis inherited the building that housed Papaya from his mother, who had received it from her third husband. She passed away 3 years ago, and Jasmine was named the heir to 100% of Claude's estate. Jasmine never changed the will you set up when you were first married." I sat in Scalia's office, trying to digest this information. "So, are you saying?" "What I'm saying is you are the sole heir to real estate valued at approximately $2.8 million. There are no living relatives to challenge the will, which includes a restaurant and retail space," he explained, listing specific properties. I recognized some of them. Papaya was now called Typhoon, with a Pan-Asian fusion menu. Vi was the executive chef, and Nephi and her partner were running the coffee shop. With a new menu and decor, business was booming. Nephi's partner wasn't Dennis, who had tried to rekindle things with her after that terrible night at Papaya. Dennis had remained a friend but never spoke about the plan for revenge. Nephi was now with EKA, a childhood friend who had cared for her while she was back home. They were engaged and preparing to marry soon. Baki had moved to America as well, leaving his farm to a cousin who had grown tired of fishing. Baki was a perfect fit for Typhoon with his pleasant demeanor and unique charm, making him popular with customers. There were moments I questioned if what we had done was right. I still wondered about it, but I never felt guilt. I was happy that my family was thriving. As I left the manicurist, I felt a sense of satisfaction that my hands were clean. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.